Welcome back, everybody. It's Zach here, bringing you guys a fantasy football video. So I'm going to be going over my wide receiver tier list. I've sort of broken about 50 wide receivers into 9 tiers here. This one will close out our tier list video series. So I've already done the quarterbacks, running backs, and tight ends. So if you haven't watched those videos and you're interested, I highly recommend you do go take a look at them. I tend to find that tier-based rankings are the best way to go into your draft prepared. It helps you really identify where the major positional fall-offs are and makes sure that you're properly taking the best position in each spot in your draft, and really just helps you understand where the value drops offs are and all that are. So obviously my tier lists are my own. I'm not necessarily basing them off of my rankings entirely. There are players that I have projected higher that I have ranked lower, and vice versa, just because I'm generally trying to clump these guys into the order that I'd actually be looking to draft them in, and where I actually view those like clear drop-offs to be. So a lot of fun doing this, a lot of fun looking at these and then seeing how my rankings or projections actually stack up too, sort of as a fun exercise for myself to see what happens there. But really fun making these videos. This one's going to be a long one, so maybe go grab a snack or something. This is probably going to be a 35, 40-minute video, just with how many players we got to talk about. But really fun making it, and just, yeah, been a lot of fun. So that being said, let's just get into the first tier. So starting things off with tier 1, these are just the elite wide receiver guys that legitimately could be the wide receiver 1, and honestly, I think you could almost interchange these two guys. We'll start off here with CeeDee Lamb being drafted as the wide receiver 1, going second overall. He stats out as my wide receiver 1, and I would certainly draft him as such as well. Just no target competition really for him in Dallas in what's actually a really pass-heavy offense. He showed last year how elite he can be, and we've always known he's a really talented player, but it was really awesome last season to really see him step up into being that true alpha, being that clear-cut number 1 wide receiver in fantasy, and I don't see any reason for that to change this season, so I think it's wheels up for CeeDee again this year. And then Tyreek Hill, same thing. He's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 2, going 1 pick after CeeDee Lamb is the 3rd pick off the board. Stats out as my wide receiver 2 as well. He's just too good of a player. He's another one of those guys, like, if anybody in the NFL is going to break the receiving yardage record this season, it's probably him. Every single year he flirts with 2,000 receiving yards at this point, and he's honestly got a great shot to do it again if he can stay healthy. So super excited about both these guys. Obviously, you can't go wrong taking either one of them, and it's just a matter of you got to have a top 3 pick to get them. But super excited for both these guys. Love watching them play, and they're going to be really good again this season. Moving on to tier 2 here, these are going to be the 3 wide receivers that I think have legitimate shots at also finishing as the wide receiver 1 overall, but that I don't actually think are good enough to quite make it into that first tier. I'll start things off with Amon-Ra St. Brown, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 5, going 6th overall in drafts. It's really crazy right now if you go look at most draft boards. It's pretty chalk to see Christian McCaffrey go as the first player off the board, and then the next 5 picks are often wide receivers. Really different and a really big contrast from what we've seen in years past, but Amon-Ra stats out as my wide receiver 4. We know he's a super talented player. He's probably the safest draft pick you can make at the wide receiver position just because of how involved he is close to the line of scrimmage, how much they utilize him all over the field. It's going to be a really good offense. The Lions really don't even have to play outside the season. They're going to be effectively indoors for every single game this year. They're going to be an offense that's going to put up a lot of points. Amon-Ra's obviously got a shot at double-digit touchdowns. Probably going to catch over 100 passes again. Easily going to break 1,000 yards. He's a really great player, and the only, if you want to say there's a downside, is just that he doesn't really have those like 200-yard receiving games. He's not a guy that gets used downfield as like a vertical threat as much as some of these other guys. So those true boom weeks come a little bit less often, but that also means he's a more reliable weekly asset. So just sort of what kind of player you want as your wide receiver 1. I love Amon-Ra, especially in full PPR formats. I think he's got a great shot at finishing as the wide receiver 1 this season. After that, we've got Ja'Marr Chase, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 3, going 4th overall. He actually projected out as my wide receiver 9. I was a little bit less bullish on the Bengals this season just because of all the issues we saw last season. We're really banking on Joe Burrow coming back to full form here. But assuming Joe Burrow is 100% of what Joe Burrow can be, then there's no reason Ja'Marr Chase can't finish as the wide receiver 1. We know he's arguably the best wide receiver in the NFL. I think him and Justin Jefferson, along with CeeDee and Tyreek, are probably the 4 guys you could put in that conversation right now. And he's obviously super exciting. He does sort of disappear from week to week, and then he'll come back with a 30 or 40-point game. So pretty big contrast to what Amon-Ra offers you on a weekly basis. But Ja'Marr Chase is going to have several week-winning performances this season. He's obviously a really great player, and I'd be super excited to have him on any of my fantasy rosters. After that, we got Justin Jefferson here. He stats out as my wide receiver 5. He's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 4, going 5th overall. It was hard for me to put him into this tier, actually. I wanted to move him one tier lower, but he was just too talented and too good for me to really ignore. We saw him put up some really monster numbers last season, even with Nick Mullins and not having Kirk Cousins. So and that was how I talked myself into putting him here. I know the quarterback downgrade is going to be significant going away from Kirk Cousins here, but we're probably going to see a mix of Sam Darnold and J.J. McCarthy this season. I wouldn't expect a 2,000-yard season out of Justin Jefferson, but anything's possible with how talented this guy is. He's probably, at least if you ask me, I do think he's the most talented wide receiver in the NFL, and those kinds of like true alpha, like Hall of Fame talent players can almost overcome quarterback play to an extent. So I think Justin Jefferson's still going to be great. I would expect a slight tick down from what we've seen in years past this season, but I wouldn't be afraid of taking Justin Jefferson. He's too talented to really put up a bad year. Next up, we've got tier 3 here. These are some guys that I think have a legitimate shot at finishing as top 3 assets, but not necessarily guys that I think could finish as the wide receiver 1. I'll start things off with A.J. Brown, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 7, going 10th overall. He stats out as my wide receiver 8. Honestly, A.J. Brown could certainly finish as the wide receiver 1. We've seen him put up stretches like last season where he was the wide receiver 1 over the first 8 weeks of the year. We know he's a guy that can put up 15 receiving touchdowns. He gets used downfield. Super excited about him. The only real question marks here is that the Eagles' offense looked pretty bad over the back half of last season. They've got a new offensive coordinator in Kellen Moore. They've got Saquon Barkley coming in. They don't have Jason Kelce. There are some moving pieces in this offense, so it's tough to necessarily say it's just going to be copy-paste from what we've seen in the last 2 years. But A.J. Brown's super talented. I think he's obviously got a great shot to be a wide receiver 1 this season, and being even the wide receiver 1 is certainly something that he could do. After that, we've got Puka Nacua currently being drafted as the wide receiver 6, going 9th overall. He actually stats out as my wide receiver 3, so at least from a projection standpoint, I am super bullish on Puka. The only red flag here for Puka, I guess, is twofold. One, Cooper Kupp should be healthier this season than he was last year. We saw Kupp miss the first several weeks of last season and sort of have to battle through injury the rest of the way. That really cleared a path for Puka to emerge as the number 1, and I do think Puka is still clearly the wide receiver 1 in this offense. I clearly think he's going to have a really great year, but there are a couple of outs that could result in him having a bit of a disappointing season. One of them being that it's technically possible for Cooper Kupp to still come back and be the wide receiver 1 in this offense. It's not something that I'm expecting to happen, but it could. And then the other real only concern I have with Puka is just Stafford and his health. We've seen Stafford miss games in the past. He's a year older than he was last season, like every single other player in the NFL, but that is something to be a little bit concerned about. But I have no concerns really with Puka Nacua. He's a guy that I'd be comfortable drafting as my wide receiver 1, and I think we're just set up for another really great year for Puka. And then the next guy, this is one that's really exciting for me. That's going to be Marvin Harrison Jr., currently being drafted as the wide receiver 9, going 14th overall, so really early in the second round. He stats out as my wide receiver 6. He is someone that I'm super bullish on. I do think he's going to step into the NFL right away and be an elite tier player, be a guy that's going to command a 28% target share from Kyler Murray and what should be a good offense. And he's going to get used all over the field. He's going to put up some big plays. He's going to score touchdowns. I think Marvin Harrison Jr.'s got a shot to finish as a top 5 wide receiver this season. And I think even though he's being drafted as high as he is, I actually have no problem with the value. If you want to take him in the early second round, it doesn't bother me. I think he's definitely got a shot at putting up a really monster year, and there's a chance that this is actually the cheapest you're ever able to draft Marvin Harrison, to be honest. Up next here, we've got tier 4. I'm going to categorize these guys as just the young studs. It was really easy to actually make this tier because I think all 4 of these players are super similar, especially the first 3 we're going to talk about. So start things off with Garrett Wilson, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 8, going 11th overall. He stats out as my wide receiver 10, so I'm a little bit below consensus on him, but I still see obviously a ton of upside here for Garrett Wilson. There are the same red flags as there were last season. You're coming into a year with a new quarterback. We are betting on Garrett Wilson taking that step forward in his career, and he's certainly talented enough to do it, but it's really a bet on Aaron Rodgers just as much as it's a bet on Garrett Wilson. So I don't actually find myself drafting a lot of Garrett Wilson right now. I find that having to spend a first-round pick on a guy that I'm not confident in is just not something I'm really trying to do. I think that obviously he's super talented, but the concern is that I don't even know how talented Aaron Rodgers is at this point. He was regressing a little bit for a couple of years before he left Green Bay, played less than a quarter last season before tearing his Achilles, and doesn't necessarily seem like he's the most focused right now. He's missing off-season minicamp away from the team. I know he's Aaron Rodgers. He's a Hall of Fame quarterback. It's maybe wrong to doubt him, but I think there's a lot of concerns there for me, and having to put that high of a draft capital on a player that I don't have a locked and loaded level of confidence in is just something that I'm a little bit wary of. So I don't find myself drafting Garrett Wilson a whole lot, even though obviously of these guys, he's maybe got the highest upside of all of them. After that, we've got Chris Olave, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 11, going 16th overall. He stats out as my wide receiver 11, so I'm right around consensus ADP. I do personally think that Chris Olave is one of the most talented young wide receivers in the NFL. He's a guy that I think clearly has a shot at being a top 5 wide receiver. We've heard a lot of reports this offseason about how the Saints are going to run a much more modern looking offense this season. They're going to run a lot more motion. Chris Olave has talked openly about how they're really utilizing his strengths now, and that's something that we can be super excited about. And on top of that, there really isn't a third wide receiver in this offense. A.T. Perry is reportedly not performing well in minicamp, so it's going to be Olave and Rashid Shaheed out there all the time. And that's a really good, exciting receiving core in New Orleans. I think that we could see Chris Olave potentially actually break out this season. I know I was super high on him last year. It just didn't quite ever pan out, but all the same reasons for optimism are there, plus some this year. So super excited about Chris Olave. The price tag is really high. You're spending a high second-round draft pick on him. That's more expensive than he was last year when he went in like the late second, early third. So there are reasons to be concerned there just because of how expensive he is. But the upside's there. If he ends up being your second-round pick, I've got no problem with that at all. After that, we've got Drake London going drafted as the wide receiver 10, going 13th overall. He actually stats out as my wide receiver 7, although I still am a little bit wary of him. It's a really similar situation to Garrett Wilson, actually. You're betting on a really young, talented wide receiver performing really well with an older quarterback coming off of a torn Achilles. So it makes a lot of sense that these guys are getting drafted super close to each other. I see both sides of what could happen here with Drake London. I do think he's extremely talented, and I'm not really worried about the target competition around him. I know some people think that technically there's a shot Kyle Pitts comes in and ends up being the one. We know Bijan's going to get a ton of targets, but Drake London's an elite player. He's going to have a good year. It's just a matter of how good, and that's all going to boil down to what Kirk Cousins is able to offer at this point. So I like Drake London. Spending the 13th overall pick on him, that's a little bit too high for me. It's not something that I find myself doing all that often, but he's obviously a really talented player. He could be a top 5 wide receiver this season. It's just a matter of how confident you are in the Falcons. Then last I'm going to talk about is going to be Nico Collins being drafted as the wide receiver 14, going 19th overall. Currently stats out as my wide receiver 24. I'm going to want to take a look at how I statted out the Texans again. Another reason why it's fun making these tier lists and everything, because I do think I would take Nico Collins in a similar tier to these guys, but in my projections he was way lower. So I'm going to want to take a look at that. I did have Tank Dell actually statted out for basically the same thing as Nico, so that could be why Nico got dragged down a little bit, but I do think Nico is going to be a really good player this season. I have no real problem with the price tag as a late second round draft pick. He's a guy that could clearly be a top 10 wide receiver. We saw him put up a monster stretch last season after Tank Dell went down. We know that CJ Stroud's clearly going to be a future star in the NFL if he's not already, and Nico is going to be the wide receiver 1 in this offense in all likelihood. He just received a massive extension. I'm not really at all worried about Stephon Diggs. Stephon Diggs did not look good at all in Buffalo over the back half of last season. I think in all likelihood, Stephon Diggs ends up being the wide receiver 3 on that team, and it's going to make Nico Collins a really great value. So of the 4 guys on this list, I actually think Nico might be the best value, and I'd just be super excited to really have any of them on my rosters, but I don't find myself drafting a whole lot of Garrett Wilson or Drake London, and I do see myself drafting a decent amount of Olave and Nico this season. Next up, we've got tier 5 here. These are guys that I think are probably going to finish in that like wide receiver 10 to 18 range. I'm categorizing them as like probably high-end wide receiver 2s, but they're all really talented players. I'll start things off with Jalen Waddle, who is obviously a super talented player. He's someone that could easily be a top 5 fantasy asset if something were to happen to Tyreek Hill, so it's sort of nice having that baked into his ADP as well. Going 21st overall, he stats out as my wide receiver 15, so he's going right around where I do think he should be going. I think he's obviously going to perform better than he did last season. He missed a lot of snaps last year. I know he played in most games, but he's banged up on and off over the course of the season, had to come off field when what it felt like was like every single game last season. And I think just things didn't quite break right for him. We didn't see as many big play touchdowns, and he's still super talented. I love having him as my wide receiver 2 on my roster. I think he's in a really great spot where you can draft him there, and I do find myself drafting quite a bit of him. So I like Jalen Waddle a lot this season. I expect him to bounce back for sure. After that, Davante Adams being drafted as the wide receiver 12, going 17th overall. Stats out as my wide receiver 14. I don't really have any concerns about Davante Adams. I do think that his best days are clearly behind him. We know that he was once probably the best wide receiver in the NFL, and he's just not that good anymore. He's still a probably top 10 wide receiver in the NFL, going to command a really high target share, but there are definitely some concerns there. We could see him regress. He's getting close to that age cliff for the wide receiver position. The value of the targets that he's getting in that offense are probably not going to be all that high. because we know that Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell are not necessarily going to sustain like a high-powered offense. So I don't really see a world where Devontae puts up like a 10 touchdown season for you. So but in PPR formats, he's certainly better. He's going to command a potentially near 30% target share. He is super talented. I just don't think he's got a shot to finish as like a wide receiver 5 like he has in the past. So I like him, but the ADP is a little bit rich for me. I don't find myself drafting a lot of him, but the value's fine there. I just tend to try to be out on players a year early instead of a year late. I like to avoid being the one that's holding the bag when these wide receivers and running backs reach that point in their career where they can't perform anymore. So I don't draft him a ton, but I don't really have any problem with where he's being drafted. After that, we got Mike Evans being drafted as the wide receiver 16, going 22nd overall. He stats out as my wide receiver 18. I've got no problem drafting him here. He's been actually drafted right around where I think he should, as a late second, maybe an early third round pick. I think he's at a good position to put up really similar numbers to what we saw last season. The Buccaneers did lose Dave Canales in the offseason, which I do think matters. The offense might look a little bit different, and I don't necessarily think we're going to see Baker put up as many touchdowns as he did last season, so I would expect a slight regression from what last season was, but that's baked into his ADP. Mike Evans finished the wide receiver 8 last season. I don't think we'll probably get that this season, but I think we'll probably get right around like a mid-tier wide receiver 2 and be someone that we're going to be super happy about. So I actually like the ADP of Evans. I don't mind drafting him here at all. After that, we've got DK Metcalf currently being drafted as wide receiver 21, going 28th overall. He actually stats out as my wide receiver 28. It's another one I'm going to want to take a look into because I do think he belongs in this tier in terms of like where I want to be drafting guys. I think just from how I feel about DK Metcalf this season, I think he's going to be a really valuable asset and someone that I do think I want to take quite a bit of because he's being drafted so much later than a lot of these guys. But Metcalf is certainly a player that could be a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy. We've seen him put up top 10 numbers in the past, and it's just a matter of how good this offense in Seattle is going to look. They're going to be running a more modern scheme. They've obviously changed their entire coaching staff. They're going to run a lot more 3 wide receiver sets. And they've been very vocal about wanting to get DK the ball. He sounds super excited about what they're trying to do on offense. And Geno Smith is certainly good enough to get it done here. In fact, of all the quarterbacks or all the wide receivers on this list, you could make an argument that Geno Smith is the best quarterback any of them have. I mean, Tua's probably better than Geno, but Geno's better than Aiden O'Connell. He's better than Baker Mayfield. He's probably better than rookie year Caleb Williams. So I wouldn't necessarily be concerned about quarterback play there, and I do think that DK could easily get it done. So I like the ADP of DK. I definitely find myself drafting him quite a bit, even though my rankings or projections don't suggest that I should be. And then the last player in this tier is going to be DJ Moore, currently being drafted as wide receiver 20, going 27th overall. Actually stats out as my wide receiver 13 because I do think he's going to very clearly be the wide receiver 1 in this Bears offense. I don't think this is going to be an offense that's going to support super high-end numbers out of a lot of the wide receivers there, but DJ Moore has gotten it done with way worse quarterbacks over the course of his career in this past, and I don't think there's any reason to be super low on him. He's not a guy that I normally find myself being in on, but being drafted as wide receiver 20, I think that's way too low for a guy who finishes right around there back in his like Carolina days and finished last season as a wide receiver 1. It's definitely someone that I think could easily be a top 15 guy this year, and at where he's being drafted, I do really like that ADP, so I actually find myself trying to get DJ Moore quite a bit this year. Up next here, we're going to move into tier 6, and these are going to be wide receivers that I think are likely to finish. It's like low-end wide receiver 2s, guys that are going to be really solid for your roster, but not necessarily be like league-winning assets. I'll start things off with Devonta Smith being drafted as a wide receiver 19, going 25th overall. Actually stats out as my wide receiver 29. I think that's maybe a little too low, but I think the thing with Devonta is that he's going to be a really boomer-bust sort of player. He's going to have some really high-end performing weeks. He's kind of going to disappear on a week-to-week basis as well, just because A.J. Brown is pretty clearly the wide receiver 1 in this offense. So I don't tend to find myself drafting a lot of Devonta Smith. I do think that of the players, even in this tier, he might be my least favorite of them. So, and on top of that, he's the second or third most expensive, or one of the most expensive on this tier. So not someone that I find myself drafting a ton of, but the talent's tough to deny. He's just not necessarily the kind of player that I like to draft because I think that it's going to be a relatively lower passing volume offense in Philly, and then he's also not the wide receiver 1 there. So having to spend the first pick in the 3rd round on a guy that I'm not super excited about, it's just not something that I find myself doing all that often. Next guy we'll talk about is going to be Tank Dell, going as the wide receiver 26, being drafted as 36th overall. Stats out as my wide receiver 22. I'm super excited about Tank Dell. I loved him. I talked about him a lot even last offseason. So he's someone that I thought was going to be really good coming into the NFL, and he really is a guy that I think he actually could be the wide receiver 1 in Houston. CJ Stroud and him clearly have a really good rapport. They're going to be a really good tandem in the NFL for a long time, and it's just a matter of who shakes out as the wide receiver one there. I think that you might end up having a sort of like rotational wide receiver one situation there, where 1 week it'll be Tank, 1 week it'll be Nico, maybe 2 or 3 weeks over the course of the year it'll be Stephon Diggs having a big game. So I do think that you're maybe going to have, it's going to be tough for all three of the wide receivers in that offense to put up big numbers every single week. So you will be a little bit of a headache with Tank Dell if Stephon Diggs ends up being relevant. If you haven't noticed, he hasn't made it into this tier list yet, or this tier video, so he's not someone that I'm super excited about yet. He'll be talked about in a little bit, but I'm not expecting a lot for Stephon Diggs, so I'm super excited about Dell, and I like ADP, but it's just sort of a matter of planting your flag on what that wide receiver room is going to end up being. After that, we've got Deebo Samuel currently being drafted as the wide receiver 17, going 23rd overall. He's my wide receiver 25 in my rankings right now, and I don't mind drafting him at all. I know I'm a little bit below consensus here, but I do think he's going to be a super reliable player. There is the concern that's still hanging over him with the possibility of him potentially being traded. It does sound more and more like if the Niners are to trade one of their wide receivers, it'll be Brandon Ayuk that gets moved, and that would honestly just be really great for Deebo Samuel. So I'm not worried about him at all. I don't think he's going to be a guy that's going to be a super reliable asset, just because, again, with the Niners, there are so many mouths to feed in that offense, but he is one of the guys that they do manufacture touches for. He's probably the more reliable 49ers wide receiver between him and Ayuk, so I like him quite a bit. He's not a guy that I think can finish top 10 unless Ayuk gets traded, but he is someone that's going to be really solid for you. After that, we've got Malik Nabers, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 18, going 24th overall, and he actually stats out as my wide receiver 12, so I'm way above consensus on Nabers, and I know it's tough for me to be that excited about a rookie on a Giants offense, but I really am that excited about him. I don't think people realize just how talented he is. I think in most drafts, in most draft classes, he would have very clearly been the first wide receiver off the board. It just didn't happen this season because you got Marvin Harrison Jr., who's like basically already getting penciled into the Hall of Fame just because of how much hype there is surrounding him. And I think that sort of took away from people realizing how good Malik Nabers is. But I think in a couple of years, we're going to look back on this and see Nabers as a guy that's going to end up being as good as the Justin Jeffersons and Jamar Chases of the world. And I think he's that good, and especially in this Giants offense where there's no target competition there. Darren Waller retired. He's competing for targets with Wan'Dale Robinson and Darius Slayton, Jalen Hyatt. There's nobody there to command a target share other than Malik Nabers. So even if these are very inefficient targets, Nabers is going to get peppered with potentially a low 30% target share. In fact, in my projections, I'm projecting him for like 32% of the targets, which is an insane figure. I understand that, but I really think he's going to earn that. They're going to use him close to the line of scrimmage and deep, and he's so explosive with the ball in his hands after the catch that I think he can overcome poor quarterback play and be really good. So I find myself trying to get Nabers quite a bit this year. After that, we got Brandon Ayuk currently being drafted as the wide receiver 13. Going 18th overall, he stats out as my wide receiver 23. Just a little too rich for me. He's not somebody that I'm super excited about. I think he probably peaked last season, finishing as the wide receiver 12, or wide receiver 14 actually. He's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 13, so one pick ahead of that, despite averaging 18 yards per catch last season. For context, he's averaged roughly 14 over the course of his career before that. That's a really big jump, and it's the kind of efficiency he needs to end up being a really high-end performer because the volume's not going to be there in this offense. And obviously, it's great to see that he can be that efficient. I do know that Brandon Ayuk is an extremely talented player. He's going to be someone that if he ends up getting traded, we're going to have to completely reevaluate what he's going to look like, because if he ends up in an offense that's going to throw the ball a ton, then Ayuk could actually be a monster. So we'll have to see, but assuming he stays in San Francisco, I just don't like the ADP. He's a little bit too expensive for me, and I don't find myself drafting him there. And last, we got Michael Pittman being drafted as a wide receiver 24, going 32nd overall. Stats out as my wide receiver 26. I think he's being drafted right around where he should be. He's someone that I think is going to finish as the low-end wide receiver 2. The touchdown upside really isn't there for him, just because for whatever reason he doesn't score a whole lot of touchdowns, and we know this is going to be a Colts offense. It's going to go right through Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor when they get in close. Adonai Mitchell is probably going to be a guy that's going to be a larger deep threat for them. A bigger body wide receiver would be someone that I'd expect to catch more red zone targets. So there's a little bit more target competition than there has been in the past as well, but Pittman's a talented player. He's going to be a reliable PPR asset, just not someone that I think can finish as a top 10 guy this season. Up next, we've got tier 7. These are going to be guys that I think can finish as like wide receiver 2s or 3s, sort of expecting them to finish right around that like wide receiver 30 mark, give or take, plus like 5 or 6 spots there. So I'll start things off with Cooper Kupp, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 22, going 29th overall. I have him statted out as my wide receiver 36, so I'm definitely a little bit below consensus on him. And the issue for him is really just health, along with the fact that I don't think he's the wide receiver one in that offense anymore. I do fully expect Puka to dominate the target share there. And when you're the wide receiver two on an offense, it's really tough to finish at a really high level. But I do think he's super talented. I might have him ranked a little bit too low in my projections. I think he's probably being drafted a little bit higher than I'd be comfortable with, and he's not someone that I necessarily find myself targeting, but the upside's certainly there. I'd be scared if I went into this season with no exposure to Cooper Kupp, but I wouldn't want to be overexposed as well. So it's just sort of playing your flag on whether or not you think he's going to be vintage Cooper Kupp or whether or not you think it's going to be clearly Puka's offense and whether he can still get it done or not. So I like Kupp, but I don't think he's someone that I'm super excited about drafting a lot of this season. After that, we've got Stefon Diggs, currently being drafted just one pick after Cooper Kupp, going as the wide receiver 23. Stats out as my wide receiver 40. I am just kind of out on Stefon Diggs, to be completely honest. I put him here because I think he kind of belongs in this tier regardless of how I feel about him, but he just looked really bad last season. In general, when we have older players show us that they're regressing, I think it's a really smart bet to make against them actually returning back to being what they were before. They're normally telling you something when they start playing worse than they have earlier on in their career. It's one thing if you've got a young receiver have a down year, but when you have an older guy come out with a bad season, it's just really rare that they bounce back with another high-end year, especially after being traded to a new team. I think it's a very likely scenario here where Stefon Diggs ends up being the third wide receiver in this offense, and as great as Stroud is, I doubt he's going to support 3 top 24 wide receivers this season. So I'm out on Stefon Diggs. You can draft him if you want. There's obviously upside there because he could be the wide receiver one in a really good offense, but I'm not betting on it. He's not someone that I'm targeting really at all this season. After that, we've got George Pickens, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 29, going 40th overall. He actually projects out as my wide receiver 17 right now, so I am really excited about George Pickens this season. I think he's going to catch a lot of deep passes from Russ this year. He's got a shot at flirting with double-digit touchdowns like Courtland Sutton did last season. There's a lot to be excited about with George Pickens, and there's no target competition for him there at all. This will change significantly. There are reports of the Steelers potentially trying to trade for a guy like Brandon Ayuk. If that trade happens, that's obviously going to shake up my evaluation of both of those guys quite a bit. So if something big like that happens, I'll probably put out another video just sort of going over how I feel about those guys now. But where he stands right now, I think Pickens is a really great value, and he's certainly someone that I'm targeting. Next, we've got another guy that I'm targeting quite a bit this season. That's Jayden Reed, currently being drafted as a wide receiver 34. I have him statted out as my wide receiver 19, and I'm really excited about Jayden Reed. I think he showed us last year that he's the number one wide receiver in this offense, and he did that as a rookie. And it's just so common for us to see second-year players come out and perform even better than they did the year before, especially at the wide receiver position. And we got to remember, Jordan Love was effectively playing as a starter for the first year of his career last year as well. There's a lot to be excited about in this Packers offense, and I think the only potential downside for Reed is just that it's possible that Christian Watson ends up being the wide receiver one. I know there's a lot of hype about Dontavian Wicks. I'm sure we're going to get more offseason hype about Romeo Doubs because that happens every single offseason, but Jayden Reed to me is clearly the wide receiver one in this offense. He's a guy they're going to manufacture touches for, sort of use him a lot like Debo, and he's someone that I just think is really talented. I'm super excited to see what he can do. He finished as a top 24 wide receiver last season and played through injury quite a bit as well. So I think there's a lot of room for him to grow and build onto what he did last year. And he's really being drafted as floor, if you ask me. And he's someone that I'm definitely targeting quite a bit right now. After that, we've got Amari Cooper, currently being drafted as a wide receiver 28. Stats out as my wide receiver 21. I think he's consistently going to be a value at this point in his career. He didn't look like he was slowing down really to me at all last year. The concern with him really is that his big games did come with Joe Flacco, along with every single other Browns offensive player. So that's a concern here. I do think that obviously Deshaun Watson is not going to be an elite performer for this offense, but I think with where he's being drafted, Amari Cooper is a perfectly fine value. Next, we've got Deontay Johnson, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 41. Stats out as my wide receiver 16, so I am super excited about Deontay this season. I think he's just going to fill into that role that Adam Thielen had last year. He's going to be talked about on my bold predictions video that'll come out in a couple days as well. So I'm super excited about Deontay. He's someone that I'm trying to leave almost every single draft with. I'll talk about him more later, and I talked about him before earlier, but I think he's going to catch a ton of passes. Super excited for the value of Deontay. I think he's going to be one of the guys that I'm going to try and leave every draft with this season. Next, we've got Christian Kirk, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 27. Stats out as my wide receiver 20. He's just sort of unreliable here. He's a guy that's going to catch a lot of targets, be used close to the line of scrimmage, and just sort of be Trevor Lawrence's best friend in the offense. I know people are excited about Brian Thomas, and Gabe Davis is there now as well, but neither one of those guys are guys that I'm expecting to command a very huge target share. I think Kirk's probably going to be second on the team in targets behind Evan Ingram, to be honest, but Kirk's going to be a guy that's going to catch a lot of passes, be a good asset for you. He's not going to be a top 10 wide receiver, but he's going to be a solid wide receiver 2 or 3 for you, and I think he's being drafted right around where he should. So I definitely like drafting Kirk if you want some stability. Another player you can draft if you want a little bit of stable production is going to be Zay Flowers, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 25. Stats out as my wide receiver 32 because his splits with and without Mark Andrews on the field are pretty revealing. He performed a lot better when Mark Andrews was injured last season. I know a lot of that could be taken into account with the fact that Andrews missed the latter half of last season, so Flowers was better over the back half of his rookie season. That's something we see as well. So I don't want to put too much stock into that. I think Flowers is a really talented player, but I think he's used a little bit too much like a gadget player to be like a true breakout player. He's not someone that I'm expecting a big season from, but I like him. He'll be solid, and I think he's perfectly fine value here. And the last player in this tier is going to be T. Higgins, currently being drafted as a wide receiver 30. Stats out as my wide receiver 33. I like Higgins. I think this is honestly like the best year to draft him because he's cheap now. There's nothing really that has changed for him between him and this season and last season. It's just that he's being drafted 2 rounds later, despite the fact that wide receivers are being drafted way earlier. So I like the value of Higgins quite a bit here. I know I have him ranked as my wide receiver 33, but he's a really talented player. If things break right for the Bengals, I think Higgins could certainly end up being a top 10 guy again. You'd need a lot to go right there, but it's possible for him. So I like the value there. If you want to get him as your wide receiver 3 or your flex, that's a really great thing to have on your roster. Next, we've got tier 8 here. These are going to be guys that I think are wide receiver 3s or flex caliber players this season. I'll start things off with Keenan Allen, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 33. Stats out as my wide receiver 42, just because I think he's clearly going to be the wide receiver 2 in an offense led by a rookie quarterback, which is not normally something that we're super excited about. But Keenan is a super talented player. He's going to get used close to the line of scrimmage. I think he'll be a really reliable asset, but I just don't think those spike weeks are going to be there like they were in the past. After that, we've got Chris Godwin, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 35. Stats out as my wide receiver 39. I don't really draft any of Chris Godwin just because I think he's kind of a boring draft pick, to be honest. I don't think the ceiling's really there at all. I like, especially with my flex caliber guys, I want to be able to find somebody that can actually provide me with some upside, and I don't think Chris Godwin can do that. And I think that it's definitely the range of wide receivers where I'm trying to target guys that actually have ceiling, because if you miss on a guy like this, your team is not sunk. You can find flex level, like replacement level production on the waiver wire over the course of the season. You're going to draft some guys later that can give you some value at your flex spot. So if you draft a bust here, that's totally okay, as to where if you draft a guy that's just going to give you 10 points per game, like what Chris Godwin's going to do, he'll probably finish as a top 40 wide receiver this season, but I don't think he's going to win you any weeks, and it's just not something that I'm super excited about. So I don't really draft any of Chris Godwin, even though I think he's being drafted right around where he should be. Next, we've got Calvin Ridley, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 36. Stats out as my wide receiver 47. You'll see I've got Hopkins on the same tier as well. Stats out as my wide receiver 44. He's being drafted 2 spots later. I have him actually ranked 3 spots ahead of Ridley. That's pretty much the reason why I think both these guys are in this tier for me. It's just because I don't know really which one of them is actually going to be the wide receiver 1. On top of that, you're kind of just betting on the Titans offense as well. So I would rather just take the one being drafted later. I prefer just to take Hopkins and see what happens there. Maybe Levis can take a step forward, and then you're at least tied to that offense with one of these 2 players. But it's just kind of make your bet which one you want there. I'm not super excited about really either one. I don't want to bet on this offense, but if you want to, there is obviously some upside there, so you can certainly take a shot if you want to. After that, we've got Christian Watson being drafted as the wide receiver 44. It's actually my wide receiver 35. I'm just in general higher on the Packers than what I feel like the market is. So I like Christian Watson quite a bit. It's just going to come down to whether or not his hamstrings can hold up. So that's the concern for him. But when he's on the field, if he's healthy, he's going to be a really nice flex to have. So I do like drafting him. Rashee Rice makes this list for me as well, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 46. Stats out as my wide receiver 27 because I'm currently projecting him to play 17 games. That's certainly not going to be the case. A suspension is coming for him at some point. So it'll just sort of depend on where he ends up falling after that suspension gets dropped. But I don't mind this ADP as long as he's only suspended for like 4 or 6 games. If it ends up being an 8-game suspension, I'd have to drop him down quite a bit. And then actually we've got Hollywood Brown as well. One more Chief to talk about. Currently being drafted as the wide receiver 32. He does stat out as my wide receiver 50 because, like I said, my current projections assume Rashee Rice is playing 17 games. That's going to get shifted around quite a bit after the suspension gets dropped, but I think Brown's going to be a decent flex option for us this year. And then the last tier I'm going to talk about here, I didn't want to go and talk about like every single one of the top 100 wide receivers. So what I'm going to do here is these are just the other wide receivers that didn't make it into the top 8 tiers that I still find myself drafting and liking at their ADP. So I'll start things off with Ladd McConkey. I think he's a guy that could actually finish the top 36 guy. It's just a matter of whether or not he steps in and is immediately the wide receiver 1 for Herbert, but I think he's going to, so I do like McConkey quite a bit. Curtis Samuel's a guy I like. I think he's going to get a lot of targets in Buffalo. I think he's going to be a really solid flex asset. I sort of like with Chris Godwin, it's like he's a guy that I think is going to be really solid for you, and I think you can get him super late. That's why I'm not drafting Chris Godwin, is because I think you get the same production as a guy like Curtis Samuel that several rounds later. JSN, he's a guy that I like quite a bit this season. You're just taking a bet on him taking that year 2 leap, sort of betting on maybe Lockett regressing a little bit more as well. That could happen. I definitely like the value there, especially if he's like the first wide receiver on your bench. I think JSN's got a shot at breaking out this season. Jameson Williams, another guy that you're sort of betting on a breakout. I think it could happen this year. I do think he's going to be a full-time player for them, and I like the ADP quite a bit. It seems like it's almost obvious that he's going to have the best season of his career here. So I'm excited about Wilt Williams, and I think I do find myself drafting him quite a bit. Then we've got Rashid Shaheed, someone that I've always liked the talent on, and he's going to be a full-time player in the Saints offense, so I like drafting him where he's being drafted. Keon Coleman could easily be the wide receiver 1 as a rookie for the Buffalo Bills. That's hard to ignore, especially where he's being drafted in like the 9th or 10th round. Brian Thomas, same thing, could be the wide receiver 1 in this Jaguars offense, being drafted in a really similar spot. I like the upside there for sure. And something that I've noticed as well is if you draft rookie players and they have spike weeks, they're actually really easy players to trade during the course of the season because everyone thinks that breakout's happening. You can almost get full value for them, even if they end up hitting. Like last season, I traded Josh Downs at like week 8 for Rachaad White before Rachaad White had broken out. And then obviously that worked out super well for me. But that's just sort of something I like to keep in mind of as well, is that these rookie wide receivers and running backs, when they have big weeks, their trade value spikes because people think that breakout is happening. So I do always like to have some rookies on my roster as well. And then we've got Dontavion Wicks. He's going super late, but I think he's super talented. Like I said earlier, I'm super high on this Packers offense in general. I don't think Wicks is going to end up being the wide receiver 1, but he's got a shot too. He's a talented player, looked really good when given the opportunity, so I don't want to just completely ignore him. Khalil Shakir is someone that I do like as well. Another guy that's probably going to be like a flex tier player for us, but he could command a lot of targets in this Bills offense, especially if he can just take a step forward as well. It'll be interesting to see how that Bills wide receiver room shakes out. I do think Shakir is probably the wide receiver 3 there, but if you want to take a shot on any of them, I don't mind it at all. Marvin Mims, someone I wanted to highlight as well. I do think he's a guy that's going to potentially take a step forward, could be the wide receiver 1 in Denver this season. They do obviously have Troy Franklin and Courtland Sutton there as well, but something else I wanted to highlight is if your league rewards return yardage or even return touchdowns, I do think that's going to play a bit of a larger role this season. They're going to be returns in pretty much every single game now. We're not going to have, if you just don't know, the kickoff rule got changed. I think now the ball is brought out to the 30 if there's a touchback, so teams are not incentivized to kick it through the end zone anymore. You're going to have a lot of returns this season, and especially if your league rewards return yards, like in my home league, we give a player a point for every 25 return yards. That's going to add up for a lot of these guys. You're going to have guys getting 5 or 6 kickoff returns a game sometimes. That can easily turn into 100, 150 return yards, and that's several points. So keep that in mind. Obviously, look at your league scoring, but Mims is a guy that's going to be a contender to lead the league in returning yardage this season, and he's obviously a talented deep threat as well. So I do like him. Demario Douglas, I like him quite a bit to potentially be the wide receiver 1 in New England this season. Definitely a full PPR asset that I like quite a bit, but a lot of reports are that he's clearly the number 1 wide receiver in New England right now. I think people are sort of forgetting about him because they drafted 2 rookies in Polk and Baker, but I do like him for sure. Ricky Pearsall, I want to talk about him. He is the rookie wide receiver for the 49ers, currently being drafted in like the 16th round, being drafted super late, but he's going to be on the field quite a bit for them, and if one of the wide receivers, either Ayuk or Debo, gets traded, Pearsall could come in and absolutely dominate right away, so I definitely like him. Sort of a stash right now more than anything, but definitely could be really good. Jalen McMillan, another rookie that I like, drafted in the 3rd round by the Buccaneers. He's going to be the 3rd wide receiver for them, and I do think this is a chance that he outplays Godwin and ends up being the wide receiver 2 there. So keep an eye on him super late. A.D. Mitchell, another guy that I like quite a bit. It's going to depend how this Colts offense looks with Anthony Richardson under center, but if they end up airing it out a little bit more than we think they're going to, I like the talent in Mitchell quite a bit. He's a guy that I think is going to have some spike weeks, so I do like him where he's being drafted. And then Jacoby Myers, the last guy that I find myself drafting sometimes too. He's super cheap right now, and he finished the top 24 wide receiver last season. going to be involved to get into this Raiders offense. A talented player, just gets overlooked wherever he is, but he's going to be a decent flex asset for you guys and someone you could definitely do worse than. So I like him for sure. That'll do it for the wide receiver tier list. Super long video, so if you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. Hope you guys found it useful. If there were any players that I didn't talk about, I know I obviously didn't touch on every single wide receiver. Just let me know in the comments. I'm happy to give you guys my opinion on any players. So if I did miss somebody that you wanted to hear about, just let me know. I'll definitely give you my opinion there. If you guys disagree with anything or had anything that you thought stood out, let me know in the comments as well. It's always super fun interacting with you guys. Really fun making these videos. I'm getting super excited for football here. We're in mid to late June right now, so we got just like 2 more months before we're really into the thick of draft season, and we're going to get a lot more news in preseason and all that coming up soon. So super excited. There are going to be a lot more videos coming out. Going to keep doing 3 to 4, maybe even 5 videos a week over the course of the next several months. We'll keep doing that through the course of the regular season as well, and we'll be here all year long to help you guys win your fantasy league. Up next, in a couple days, you guys will get the bold predictions video. I'm going to go over 5 bold predictions for this season that I think, despite being unlikely, are actually things that have a pretty good shot at happening and are things that I think could be really advantageous towards helping you win your leagues if you sort of bet on those. So it's going to be a lot of fun. If you want to make sure you guys don't miss any of that, just make sure you subscribe to the channel. That way I can be here all year long to help you guys out and give you guys as much advice as I can. So thank you guys for watching. If you made it this far, please do give the video a thumbs up. I hope you guys liked it if you made it this far at least. So thanks again, and I'll catch you next time. Peace. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.